But what we are going to cover is kind of how we went from the intermediaries legislation that came in 2000 to off payroll working that's already in the public sector and coming into the private sector from April of this year. And again, want to sort of have a look at how the market's reacting, particularly end clients, because of course they've got the responsibility. So that's really where the whole issue now starts. Yes, very much how this impacts you, what you can do to prepare for the changes, and again, for some people, it's going to have a significant impact on their earnings. Before I continue, there's the next slide is really Andy talking about how IPSE are approaching this whole issue. You're on mute, Andy.
The phrase of last year, you're on mute. Yes, I just want. Thanks very much, Paul, for giving me the. I just wanted to. This presentation, as Paul says, is all about what the change is happening, preparing you for that, what you can expect, and talking through the sort of practicalities of it. But I'm grateful to Paul for the opportunity just to jump in here and say that we at IPSE continue to oppose the IR35 legislation. We were set up in opposition to IR35 in 1999, 2000 when it first came in, and we are opposed to this change that we're talking about here today. And we continue to lobby government about this. We are pushing for a further delay, and we've already had questions about this. The government at the moment is absolutely intent on bringing this in there, and that is why it is so important that we do prepare people as best we can for what looks likely to be this change, a very strong likelihood that this is going to come in. We're pushing for a fundamental review of the tax system that would improve things and remove the need for IR35. In the meantime, this is one of a series of webinars that we have been doing and will continue to do on IR35. We continue to update guidance on our website. We go to events where we speak to clients to try to get them to understand what IR35 means and to press the point home that they don't need to put all their engagements inside IR35 or do blanket banning of contractors as some have done. And we're also updating our website with information for you around some of the things that Paul will no doubt talk about here, such as the client-led dispute resolution procedures. We have a contract review service, which we do with Markel, what it means to be working via an umbrella company, talking about small client exemptions and what that means for you as contractors, and then things like contracted out services as well. So that's really just my bit. I'm going to turn off my webcam now, but I will be here and listening and clicking through the slides with Paul, and I'll turn it back on at the end when we get to the questions. Thanks, Paul.
Good, brilliant, thank you. So thanks for moving it on. Yeah, so really let's just briefly talk about kind of how we got to where we are. The whole point about IR35, to give it its full name, is the intermediaries legislation. The issue that HMRC had all those years ago was how they tackled what they perceived to be disguised employment. So people setting themselves up as limited companies so that they could avoid paying national insurance and so that they could take dividend payments, but also from the employer side of things, the opportunity to take people on really as employees, but actually not have to contribute the employer's national insurance. So that was HMRC's issue, or the Inland Revenue, of course, as it was then. So from HMRC's point of view now, what we're about to talk about here actually isn't changing in the future, and that's one of the key things to understand. How we understand and actually look at IR35 is not going to be changing. So that's not the key change, it's how it's operated. So it's still all about creating this hypothetical contract. So you've got the end client that's decided that they want to undertake a project or basically move in a different direction. They don't have the in-house resources to deal with that. They look externally, typically, but not always, will engage in a recruitment agency to find the individuals that they need. And those individuals will be engaged through their own service company. I'm going to use the dreaded term personal service company, or PSC, from time to time. And typically that service company will have the individual as the worker. So when you look at the contractual chain, both the end client and the agency are actually engaging limited companies. You can't employ a limited company. So from their point of view, there are no issues around status in the current environment in the private sector. Things have clearly changed in the public sector, things will be changing in the private sector. So the whole issue around IR35, the whole status issue, because that's what it effectively is, tax employment status, is focused on the service company. So each and every engagement has to be determined by your company. You have to decide whether that engagement is inside or outside of IR35. And essentially the creating the hypothetical contract is HMRC saying, if you as an individual were engaged by the end client directly, so there was no intermediary in the chain, and the intermediary is actually not the agency, it's your company. If you remove that from the equation, what would the relationship look like? Would it look like one of employment, which is clearly what HMRC are batting for, or is it more akin to a relationship of self-employment, which is clearly what you as a contractor would be hoping would be the outcome? So the question that we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we actually arrive at that decision? What's the question that we ask? So if we go on to the next slide, please, Andy. And the question that we ask, and as I said before, these issues hadn't changed, is the question that was asked in ready mix concrete, and that was back in 1968, well before IR35 was a concept, if we can put it like that. But what this determined was what an employee looks like. So bizarrely, the question we ask is, do we have an employment relationship? And if we can answer no to that, then the engagement falls outside of or is not caught by IR35. And the three key things that make you an employee, and I'm an employee of Markel, is that first of all, in no particular order, but first of all, I have to provide my personal service. I can't get up tomorrow morning and decide to send somebody else along. I've got to show for work. Secondly, there is somebody above me in the food chain that can control my day-to-day working. Now, they may largely leave me alone, but I do have a boss that can and will ask me from time to time to go and attend a meeting or to contact a client, or in those days when we could go into the office, to come into the office for a meeting. So there is that control over what I do. And then this third factor, mutuality of obligations, this is probably the most nebulous of the three, and at its base level, it's about, is there an obligation for work to be offered and for that work to be accepted? And clearly that is the case in an employment relationship. And if the work ever dried up, then the company's either got to pay me to twiddle my thumbs or more likely make me redundant. Well, if you are a contractor and we get to Friday and there's no more work, then basically the end clients can say, well, that's it, thank you very much, we don't need you back next week. Similarly, in terms of control, what you want in your contract, if you want to deny the end client a right of control, is a clause that effectively says that your company, as the service provider, the contractor, whatever the title is given to your company, is responsible for the method of the performance of the services, i.e. you control how the work is done. And then the third element, personal service, it is about denying that there is a requirement for your personal service, and typically that will be via a substitution clause, although it doesn't have to necessarily be phrased quite like that, but typically you'll see a substitution clause, and for that to be valid, it needs to give you a clear right to substitute, not a right to propose, but actually a right to substitute. Secondly, yes, clearly the end client must have a right to refuse if your substitute doesn't have the relevant skills, qualifications, or experience, and sometimes perhaps you can bring security into the mix here as well. But if the right is fettered any more than that, then it's too fettered and it wouldn't be a genuine right. The third element has got to be in terms of handover. Clearly, if you need to hand over to your substitute, whether that takes you hours or a number of days to do that, there's no reason why the end client should pay for that, because they've paid for work to be provided, not for you to train somebody else up to do that work. And then the fourth element, and this is very important, you need to stay in the contractual chain. So if the chain was like the earlier slide, end client, agency, your company, then if you engage a substitute, they need to come in under your company and not replace your company. Because if they do replace your company, it's not substitution. And the other key thing to be aware of, if there are certain responsibilities within your contracts, even boiling down to things like how much PI that you've got to have, make sure you've got those same requirements in your contract. Everything needs to flow through. Now, if those four things are in place, you have a genuine right to substitute. Now, what Justice McKenna said back in 1968 was, with those three things in place, we have an employee. If one of those three things is missing, then it cannot be an employment relationship. So ergo, it must be a contract for services. Now, in reality, even today, even with some of the more recent cases, you probably wouldn't want to argue mutuality of obligations on its own. Ideally, you'd want to be able to show that either there's no right of control over you, or there's no obligation to provide your personal service. Obviously, if you've sent a substitute, you've clearly demonstrated that, but it is about the right to do these things. Obviously, if you've got all three, brilliant, but actually you only need one. Now, where you can't decide on those three factors, that's where you look at the secondary factors, things like financial risk. Well, invoicing is financial risk because invoices don't necessarily get paid on time. Sometimes they don't get paid at all, or in full. Things like business enterprise, using the services of an accountant, buying professional indemnity insurance. These are things that you wouldn't do if you're an employee. So all those things build up that picture, but it's the primary factors where you really need to win the argument. Andy, can we move on to the next slide, please? So the basis of understanding IR35 hasn't changed. It didn't change in the public sector, but what it did do is redefine some of the responsibilities, because in the private sector currently, previously in the public sector, it was always down to the service company, down to the PSC to determine the status of the engagement, and the PSC had the liability as well. Well, what emerged from the public sector changes is suddenly public sector departments, the NHS, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Defence, whatever, suddenly had to become status experts, because they had to determine what the status of the engagement was. It also introduced this concept of the fee payer. Now, the fee payer is actually nothing more than the entity which pays the personal service company. So an end client can be both decision maker and fee payer, but more often than not, where there's and certainly where there's an agency in the chain, the agency that's closest to the PSC is the fee payer. And actually, the fee payer has the liability if the decision taken above them is wrong, providing reasonable care has been taken, and we'll come on to that in a bit. But what became very clear, and something that HMRC have sought to address, and I'll leave you to be the judges of whether you think they have, is that the reasoning behind the decisions was unclear. And in fact, I think a lot of people accept, HMRC don't, but a lot of people accept that there are an awful lot of blanket decisions that were made in the public sector. And certainly it was very clear that there was no actual right of appeal for contractors. And that's something that, again, that HMRC have sought to address with the new legislation.